Right. Thank you all for joining us here. My name is Vaughn Gordon. I'm the Youth Engagement Manager with the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. We are a Jackson-based nonprofit that has been around for 21 years now. I am really excited that we have people who are joining us on our Facebook page, the Committee for Kings Facebook page. I am going to take about 10 seconds just to double check our stream there and make sure everyone is in. All right. Well, I'd like to thank the Committee for King, a phenomenal group of people in Tupelo and Lee County, Mississippi, for their steadfast leadership over many years in helping us realize a dream of a more equitable and just America and a more equitable and just local community here. Um, I want to thank them on behalf of the board of the Winter Institute and our staff. And I want to welcome all of our partners. We will have what I hoped is a robust conversation this afternoon following a brief introduction of our topic. This is a really important topic for people all over the United States. I think the reckoning of social justice and justice reckoning of the last year in our country has put on this on display the myriad systemic challenges we have, and we are in a place now where I think for communities we need to go deeper, and hopefully this is going to be a good opportunity for us to do that. I am really excited to have a panel of phenomenal people who are subject matter experts. You will meet them in about 20 minutes, but we will be joined then by Dr. Sandra Melvin of the Institute for the Advancement of Minority Health, Mr. Ki Burt from the Hope Policy Institute, Ms. Jennifer Calvert, who is a phenomenal young educator of young people in Monroe County and the northeast Mississippi. Dr. Kathy Grace, who is likewise a phenomenal educator at the Graduate School for Early Learning at the University of Mississippi. Ms. Leslie Faith Jones with the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose expertise is in criminal justice. I am really excited to have you all with us. For those of you who've joined the webinar, you'll get to see their faces uh, in just a little while. So to get started here, I'd like to go and share some basic information with the audience as a way of introducing this topic. So let me share my screen here and get us going. All right. So as I said earlier, I am a part of the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. I am its youth engagement manager and a part of the community building team. As an organization, the Winter Institute seeks to follow a process or a model where we intentionally engage with people in a space that's designed to help them build trust and build community at a deeper level. We use highly facilitated and open and honest dialogue models. We believe that by using those, it allows us to build bridges of trust, as we say, that are strong enough to bear the weight of the truth that must be told in communities. Our process at the heart of it is storytelling and learning. We hope that through that, people get to do in-depth examination of themselves and the people around them, share experiences and the lessons learned from those experiences, and then finally, We want people to take the relationships that they've built and the trust within those within those relationships, and the things that they um, have discovered that they share collectively, and take them to create and renew their local communities. So thank you. Um, Thank you again to the Committee for King for allowing us to be a part of this. In our work, we use something that I'd like to share with those of you in advance of the work that I know you're going to do following this series of forums. These are our welcome table guideposts. They are the tools that we believe must be used or can certainly be used. They are time tested as way of as a way of keeping a space strong enough for the personalities and the perspectives, but also for the challenges that people in that space must face together. I won't go through and read them all, but I would like to point out a couple of them that I think will be particularly useful in this webinar and as we engage with the subject of systemic racism going forward. One of them is listening deeply to learn. Uh, there are there's so much data, there's so many different perspectives around systemic racism and its challenges for us, especially local, that I know it's critical that we listen deeply to learn as we engage with this topic. Uh, the last of the nine that I'll lift up is to trust the circle. Dr. King, among many other leaders we've had over generations, have always encouraged us to build trust amongst ourselves, create communities within our community where we can work together and we can build together. So I challenge those of you listening to take those to heart as you hear from our panelists later and as you process some of the things that I am sharing now. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi said in his National Book Award winning book, quote, "We have been taught that ignorance and hate lead to racist ideas, which lead to racist policies. If the fundamental problem is ignorance and hate, then your solutions are going to be focused on education and love and persuasion. But of course, the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic and political and cultural self-interest." Here are a couple of useful terms in my work with the Winter Institute and just growing up. I've discovered that language matters a lot and the terms that we use matter a lot. And it's important that we have a shared understanding of what the terms mean. One term that is often used in interracial or community conversations is prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived judgment or opinion, often based on limited information. As a matter of fact, that information is not always correct or accurate information. Racism is a social political construct used to group people and to differentially allocate resources in society based on that grouping. It's a system of advantages based on race. And of course, where you find advantages or privileges, you will find disadvantages as well. Structural racism, which will be the focus of our conversation today and for our four subsequent sessions, is defined as by Dr. Tricia Rose, who's a PhD, really well-known and celebrated academic, describes structural racism in the US as the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. We know that that is true for the United States writ large, but also here in the state of Mississippi. And we've seen it play out in our local communities as well. Our organization's namesake, may he rest in peace, Governor William Winter, said after working with the One America initiative in the late 90s and early 2000s, that wherever, quote, he said, wherever I've gone, irrespective of racial or cultural differences, I found that people agree on several basic propositions. Everyone wants a decent education for their children. Everyone wants a fair chance to secure a job that will sustain them and their families. And everyone wants to be able to live in a decent house on a safe street. Everybody wants to access adequate health care, and everyone wants to be treated with dignity. As we get into our panel discussion later, we'll explore how systemic racism is currently destroying um, people's achievement or ability to reach the satisfaction of those propositions. But also, there will be points where we'll get to talk a little bit about that history as well. This is the last big chunk of words, but I think it's really, really important to go in a little bit of depth about the research here. Dr. Joe Feagin uh, is the author of Systemic Racism. He's a professor at Texas A&M University and has written for a long time about race and interracial uh, interactions in the United States. Dr. Hagen, or Dr. Feagin, I'm sorry, said that from the first decades of colonial America, European Americans have made oppression of non-Europeans basic to the new society. For the first 90% of this country's history, slavery or legal segregation was generally in place. Only for the last 10% or so of our entire history have we been free of slavery and legal segregation. Thus, racial oppression makes the United States very distinctive, for it is the only major Western country that was explicitly founded on racial oppression. Today, as in the past, this oppression is not a minor addition to the US's society structure, but rather is systemic across all major institutions. Oppression of non-European groups is part of the deep social structure, beginning with the genocidal killing of Native Americans and the theft of their lands, and the extensive enslavement of Africans as laborers on those stolen lands. European colonists and their descendants created a new society by means of active predation, exploitation, and oppression. I think that Dr. Feagin's words are especially valuable here. We often say in our work at the Winter Institute, with people that we work with in communities, that we didn't create the system that we are now all living in. No person living today owned slaves. No person living today was a slave in the certainly colonial and antebellum way that we think about slavery and chattel slavery. For certain, human trafficking exists today, and it is a form of modern day slavery. So, with respect to that, I will say that none of us created the system under which we live right now. However, we do have a responsibility for either perpetuating the continuation of the oppressive system that Dr. Feagin described, or being a part of the body of Americans and Mississippians who helped to dismantle it. So there are levels to oppression in general and racism specifically. This is a graph that Dr. Karen Pace from Michigan State University produced quite a few years ago that describes the level at which racism plays out. I'd like to go to the core first. Personal or kind of intra-personal values, beliefs, and feelings shape. That is where our attitudes are. It shapes how we think implicitly and what we articulate explicitly. Embedded in those beliefs, those values, those feelings are the things that we've picked up from culture, the experiences we've had that shape not only how we see ourselves, but how we see other people. So when we think about racism as a structure, it's important to recognize that there is a deep interpersonal element of it. These are the things that people can't see. These are the things that we can, um, that we sometimes live in contradiction. We try to live out something different than what is inside of us. That is the personal. Most people, I think, are used to thinking about racism at the next level, however, and that's the interpersonal. The things that your neighbor or your friend or the thing that's said to you in an unfortunate interaction in the grocery store, or the memory from your childhood of a thing that someone said to you, whether they called you an epithet or some other negative interaction motivated by your race. That is the interpersonal element. Almost all of us have been scarred in ways by those interpersonal experiences. Certainly, as an African American man growing up in Mississippi and parts of the Midwest, I have had many of those experiences. But those are the interpersonal. One of the more difficult areas, and perhaps the areas most resistant to change, however, is the next level, and that is the institutional level. Racism in institutions gets embedded or is embedded in its rules, in its policies, and its practices, and in the procedures that you see in those organizations and in those institutions. We think of our schools, a school building with a principal and assistant principals and teachers. That is an organization. And within that organization, it can have rules, policies, practices that are on their face, they may seem to be egalitarian or fair or merit based. However, when you dig a little bit deeper, if they were built on a foundation of racism, then they will continue to perpetuate racist outcomes until changed. Our hospitals as institutions had policies that would not allow patients of the same race to be on the same floor, or would not allow patients of one race to be treated by patients of another. Those are policies within individual organizations. But then there are the larger structural and systemic ways that racism plays out in our within our healthcare system. For example, as we'll get into a little bit later, you have clinics, you have our major hospital institutions. There are many spaces where the health and wellness of citizens are met. But if there are racist policies and practices at the pharmacy and at the hospital and at the clinic and in the procedures followed by the school nurse, then for that healthcare system, it is still racist in its nature. And what we have come to understand, sociologists have told us for a long time, in layman's terms, a system designed to create one outcome, an outcome that favors or provides advantage to one group of people, will continue to do that until that institution, until that system, that institution or and the system and its and the system within which it operates is changed, it will not produce a different kind of outcome. So in many ways, as we will hopefully discuss a little bit later in our panel, we still see how systems that were created generations ago, to Dr. Fagan's point, are continuing to produce racially disparate outcomes, in part because we as a society have not done the things necessary to make sure that they begin to produce more equitable outcomes. This, for people who are looking to engage and stay engaged around this work, I think is a really important slide for me to add. This is what is known as the racism action continuum. In other spaces, it's known as just generally the oppression action continuum. And what it seeks to do is identify for people where we can fall when it comes to our knowledge and actions related to different types of oppression. For systemic racism, there's an acknowledgement that on one end of the continuum are individuals and even organizations and systems that actively participate in the continued racist oppression of people. In our country, in our society, it is people of African descent, Black people, African Americans, as we have known, who have historically been on the bottom of that structure, going back to uh, the years after 1619, when the first enslaved people arrived on the shores here in America. There were distinctions built into law that made sure that those darker skinned people of African descent or African ancestry were at the bottom. They had less legal rights, so on and so forth. So there are organizations, there are institutions, there are people who are actively participating in the continuation of that. But as we move to the right on the continuum, there are there are deeper levels of engagement with what we would call anti-racist approaches. Uh, for individuals to go from actively participating to denying or ignoring the existence of, in this case, systemic racism, um, our hope for this forum, um, for my organization's engagement with people to end all discrimination based on difference, what we hope happens is that individuals, through self-examination and knowledge, gaining knowledge, will move from the left end of the continuum on my screen to the right end of the continuum. We want people to go from actively participating and perpetuating racism and systemic racism to becoming initiators and preventers of that perpetuation. That involves identifying the practices of institutions and organizations that they are part of. And it also involves expanding the knowledge, expanding the willingness to take action, and the ability to overcome our fears, the things that kind of make us less sure when it comes to challenging racist practices. They spread that information within their sphere of influence. So as we think about our fellow Mississippians, our neighbors, it is not enough to group people as racist or committed to anti-racism. As a community, it is really important to acknowledge that there's a continuum and that individuals, based on their knowledge, based on their ability to overcome fear, fall at different points on the continuum. So as we think about addressing systemic racism in all of these issues, in all of these areas of our lives, I, for one, want to challenge you all to not be quick to categorize your neighbors and friends as people who are simply racist or anti-racist, but to dig a little bit deeper, get to know them a little bit better, build your individual knowledge bases so that you can help people move along the continuum. And for my part, as a young African American man, a relatively young African American man, married with 3 kids, it is really, really important to me that I be a part of a community seeking to build and develop, build allyship and develop allies. And that is sometimes very difficult work. It can be it can hurt sometimes. But I think it's really important that we see our fellow citizens as people to be helped along a continuum, with a deep and abiding respect for where they come from and who they are and how they see themselves in the world. So the last thing that I'd like to share here before I invite our panelists to come on screen is a quote from the writer and organizer Robin DiAngelo. She says, quote, "The key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. We can use it as a door out or to escape, or we can use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? What would it mean for me if this were true? How does this lens change my understanding of racial dynamics? How can my unease help me reveal the unexamined assumptions I've been making? Is it possible that because I am white, there are some racial dynamics that I can see? Am I willing to consider that possibility? If I'm not willing to do so, then why not? I think that it is particularly important to lift this quote up for this very simple and historically accurate reason. People of color, Black people in particular, did not create the social construct of race. That construct has implications for every facet of all of our lives, but certainly for every facet of the lives of African Americans. We did not create that construct. That construct was created by a relatively small, economically elite group of people with European ancestry. That is a really important foundational truth to understand. In many ways, African Americans over the course of our history, as Dr. King has described, have been victims of that construct. It is really important for us as community members to encourage our white brothers and sisters, those who are um, at different points on the continuum, to recognize their agency and power to deconstruct racism as a social construct. We, to thrive as a community, need each other. We need everyone engaged to stop systemic racism from destroying human potential. So I think that this is a particularly fitting um, instruction from Dr. DiAngelo about how we can get beyond the discomfort, um, or how people, particularly white people, can get beyond the discomfort they have dealing with race. But if I go back to the levels of racism, there is also, because of the just the overwhelming weight of culture, there are many people, African American and people of color, who have also absorbed the messages that have devalued them over generations. It's important too that we be prepared to confront the ways that we have internalized messages, racist messages that speak to inaccurately the value of our humanity. So, with that, I'd like to share quickly a short video that I think will be good for us to view in moving into our conversation. Let me get that up. Here we go.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So with that, I'd like to invite my panelists to join me on screen with video. Dr. Melvin, Mr. Burt, Dr. Grace, and Mrs. Jones and Calvert. Let's see. All right. All right. One small technical issue here. I'll get that fixed. All right. There we go. All right. Welcome, welcome, everyone. You can all unmute yourselves at this point. Let's see. All right. Kiara, are you able to hear me?
I can.
There you go. Thank you. Awesome. Dr. Melvin? Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
There we go. All right. Ms. Calvert, thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Grace will be able to jump in with us as well. Let's see. There you go. All right. Well, thank you all. As you might imagine, this is, or as you know from your work, this is a pretty weighty topic for us. I think here in the United States in particular, I think culturally, we have just not grown up spending a lot of time developing the language to talk a great deal about it. I would like to start in my conversation with you all about talking about Jamal from the video, Jamal and his partner, as we will call them. In your different areas of work, you deal with a myriad of different issues. So what I'd like you to do is give a brief introduction of yourselves and talk a little bit about your work and how you see systemic racism playing out in it. So Dr. Grace, if you don't mind, would you go first for me?
Well, good afternoon, and thank all of you for attending and for the invitation that was extended to me. I'm an early childhood educator. I've been in early childhood business for 45 years. I've lived in Tupelo close to 30 and have many experiences working with state government, nonprofit, university settings in the classroom. So I have had a lot of different opportunities to learn and to appreciate the work of early care and education professionals as well as their families. I would say with regard to a child's development, particularly in the first 5 years of life, they will be affected by the systemic racism or the inequity in almost every area you can think of: health care, housing, in terms of the inequity that you already mentioned with regard to the families being able to borrow and being able to obtain a home in a neighborhood that they're in. Also, the education, the two young men, well, one I imagine was able to go to a pre-K program or an early childhood program, the one that was affluent. The other one, unless his family was lucky enough to have him enrolled in Head Start, it was probably going to be unlikely that he would have the same opportunities early on in life. The resources in his home, as far as books, as far as the opportunities to take trips, meet different people, there's a big difference there with regard to the affluent and then the child that is with a working family who's spending their days working 2 and 3 jobs, making minimum wage, and they don't have the time, which is another big factor in the difference between the two. So that's very, I guess, brief overview of all the different places that racism, systemic racism touches children. And I'm sure during the next several months, you'll talk more about those in depth.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Grace. Mr. Burt, you are working in a really, really critical area. Dr. Grace mentioned it even. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself and talk about your work and where you see systemic racism and its impact there.
Right. All right, so thanks for that. So my name is Kia Burt. I'm a policy analyst at Hope Policy Institute. And first, before I get started, let me kind of describe what Hope is as an organization. So Hope is a community development financial institution, a credit union, a loan fund, and a policy institute that provides affordable financial services and leverages private, public, and philanthropic resources to strengthen communities in economically distressed areas throughout our Deep South region. The Deep South region for us being Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Since 1994, we have generated more than $2.5 billion in financing that has benefited more than 1.5 million people in our 5-state region. To your question about how do I see systemic or structural racism playing out in the work that I do at Hope, and even the work that we do more generally, typically it becomes a matter of understanding where are our community, or said simply, where are we now? And there are two ways that we can look at the state of, we could say Black America, Black Mississippians today. The first is the lack of access to financial institutions. Typically, or most often, you may hear this called a bank desert, or you may hear this called, in a technical sense, unbanked and underbanked households. Okay, 45% of Black households in the United States are either unbanked and underbanked. That's 45% of 15 million Black households. And just over 50% of Black households in Mississippi are either unbanked and underbanked. Now, comparatively speaking, for white households, that's 17.4% at the national level, and it's 17.4% at the national level and 45% at the states, 17.4% at the national level and 26.1% at the state level of Mississippi. And what that means is when you have limited access to a bank or credit union, you be unbanked. And if you have you have no access, there's no bank account. You have limited access, that means you have a check on the savings account, but you still rely on alternative financial institutions such as a payday lender or check casher to get other services completed. What that means is that there's a two-tiered financial system in the United States. One where there are households that get premium financial services at cheaper interest rates. And then there's a lower system in which most financial products and services are higher, and they tend to lead to a cyclical process of a debt trap. Okay, So when we consider the state of Black Mississippians and Black Americans, we have to realize that for many of our households, they are more likely to rely on a payday lender or a check casher to get everyday financial services completed. Now, what's interesting is that for the state of Mississippi, payday lenders and car titles extract over $500 million in fines and fees from low-income houses. They do this by charging up to 500% interest rates on small dollar loans. And you're dealing with a population, at least in Mississippi, where 3 out of 4 Black households are liquid asset poor, meaning that they don't have enough money in their checking or savings account to pay expenses for 3 months or even subsist at the poverty level. So not only are you talking about predation on a poor population, we're talking about pushing their little resources into a trap where they spend most of their additional income to a predatory lender. So in my work, it looks like trying to understand where our communities are as far as access to mainstream financial institutions, and also understanding the ways in which that lack of access affects other arenas of their life, whether it be predation by predatory lenders, or it could generally, even more recently, mean the lack of access to COVID-19 relief. We see that for households that do not have a bank account, that means that they're going to get, if they qualify, they'll get their stimulus check via mail. Now, how much longer will it take for you to get a check in the mail as a direct deposit when we're facing evictions, or we're facing poor access to not just healthcare, but also to fresh food? And so my work really centers around those two elements: access to financial institutions and the ways in which we can mitigate predation of economically distressed households.
Dr. Melvin, Kia mentioned $500 million extracted from households. That's a lot of money. So in addition to talking to us about the Institute for the Advancement of Minority Health and your work, talk a little bit about what that much money can mean for people's health and wellness.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And I do want to tell you a little bit about the Institute. So I'm Sandra Melvin, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer and founder for the Institute for the Advancement of Minority Health. And conversations like this is one of the main reasons that the Institute was founded. I'm an epidemiologist by training. And after 20 years in practice, what I saw was that we developed all these interventions, but we were seeing very little impact in the community. So the Institute's work focuses entirely on community-based partnerships that also look at these interventions from the lens of health equity. Now, a lot of the things that you outlined in your presentation before we started and what Mr. Burke talked about, all point to one of the major things that we look at when we see structural racism. Basically, what we have is a system that has already been created for us to not be able to take advantage, no matter how much we do, no matter the education that we get. Our wealth is not measured the same. And it's been seen totally by events in the past as well as events now. One of the things I do want to take a moment to just point out, since we're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his message, is that when we talk about civil rights, we always focus on voting rights. We talk about desegregation of schools, but there's a tenet of the civil rights movement that has been forgotten or is not emphasized as much, and that's the premise of healthcare as a right. And as a matter of fact, one of his main quotes that I see all the time being used by people came during a rally where he focused on healthcare and people having equal right to healthcare. And that quote is, "Of all the inequalities that exist, the injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman." And so the money that Mr. Kia talked about can be used in a lot of ways. We know that the structural systems that are in place affect minority communities in several different ways, and they affect different components of the healthcare system. First of all, we can talk about access to care. $500 million can do a lot to give to add access to care to some of these communities. Now, healthcare costs a whole lot more than that, but it can start to level the playing field. When we talk about environmental hazards, though, that's housing, that's where people live. And of course, that has a direct relationship to a person's health. We're talking about food deserts, building supermarkets. If I can't get a loan in a minority community because it's been redlined and we can't put a supermarket there, then we're cutting off access for that community to healthy and nutritious foods, which affects their health. Shortage of healthcare providers. How can money be used to attract healthcare providers to rural settings where they may not have entertainment? And all those things, short of not just their occupation, the thing that they love to do every day, but what about when they're not at work? It's hard to attract healthcare providers to rural areas because there's not as much for them to do. And the other thing is it just presents a unique challenge. Even in COVID, we've all converted to telehealth, but what I think we forget is that for some rural communities, that internet infrastructure is not good. They don't have that broadband capacity to switch over into telehealth because they can't do the face-to-face. And I do want to point out one other thing. One thing you said is that an unequal structure will continue to perpetuate itself, and it can be seen in COVID-19 right now. I've looked at some of the numbers where we see increased mortality or illness rate, death and illness rates among minority communities compared to white communities, and we see that they're disproportionately affected. But here's another note that I think we need to think about. When we have a cure or a vaccine, we're still disproportionately being given the vaccine for several different reasons, not just because of this. Well, it is part of the system because we mistrust the system now. But just to tell you what it looks like in Mississippi, and we're out of vaccine now, by the way, 64% of the people who have been vaccinated are white, compared to 14% of African Americans in the state. So that tells you that there has to be something going on in a state where we make up 40% of the population and only 14% have been vaccinated. So there is a lot that we need to do, but the first thing we do need to do is acknowledge that racism is prevalent in all aspects of society. And we have to have an honest and open conversation, one without judgment, but it has to be had so that we can develop solutions. We will not do it if we don't take it head on. And it's embedded in the very fabric of us from the time that this country was created. And it can be seen in even the development of the Constitution, Jim Crow laws, Medicaid expansion. All of those are policies that cause us to be sicker and cause us to not be able to have solutions that are equitable for all communities.
Thank you very much. I recognize, Leslie, that if people are struggling financially and they've been burdened by an inadequate education and they are struggling with physical or mental health issues, just those things alone raise their chances of having to interact with the criminal justice system. That is before we even deal with inequity in the criminal justice system. Talk a little bit about your work and who you are and kind of how your vantage point as it relates to systemic racism.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you. First, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for having us and also for the comments that you all have shared today. I'm with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we were founded in 1971 with the mission of fighting hate and bigotry and seeking justice for the most vulnerable members of our society. We use litigation, legislation, public education, and other forms of advocacy to help create a world in which the ideals of equity, justice, and liberation are a reality for everyone. It is the SPLC's mission to be a catalyst for racial justice in the South, working in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. A critical aspect of our work involves leveraging the courts and working alongside lawmakers to reform America's criminal justice system. We advocate for policies that keep communities safe, while also vastly shrinking the prison population and reducing the impact of mass incarceration on society, especially in communities of color. And so just in alignment with what everyone has already shared, I just wanted to add, like a yes and, that one of our newest impact priorities is challenging the criminalization and incarceration of Black and Brown people here in Mississippi and throughout the Deep South. What a lot of people do not fully appreciate is that while part of the presentation earlier, we learned that the majority of our country's history has been about oppression, we also have to recognize that the United States is the largest, has the largest prison population on the planet. So with over 2 million people currently in our nation's prisons and jails, that's a 500% increase over the last 40 years. And what's also been happening over the last 40 years, what some of us are familiar with based on our background and our age, is the quote unquote war on crime. And so I bring that up because everything that has been shared so far, from redlining to the limited access to equity, in terms of financial strengthening in our communities, in terms of our health, and the exploitation of systems that are not designed to support Black and Brown people, we have on top of that layered a criminal justice system that targets not only our adults, but also our children. And so I add that in because what we recognize is that, honestly, over 77 million Americans, that's 1 in 3 adults, have a criminal record. And that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people, especially here in the Deep South, where in the states of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, over half of the prison population is Black. And so I want to just take a moment to say your prison population and your folks with criminal records are two distinct groups, in the sense that not everyone that has a criminal record goes to jail. Not everyone with a criminal record goes to prison. And so I include that because we also know from the research, from the data, that having a criminal record impacts everything that was shared today. It impacts education, because as an adult with a family, so for a Black man who has a criminal history, that impedes his ability to get stable employment. It impedes his ability, in a lot of cases, to even vote. It impedes his ability to work within family reunification programs and to access public benefits. And so I'm saying that because there's this underlying layer that a lot of people don't want to talk about, because we also have been conditioned through media and other sources that there's a dangerousness to certain groups of people. And we know that the criminalization and incarceration of Black and Brown folks here in this country has a long history. And we at the SPLC are working to dismantle those issues of structural racism, but we also have to just uncover the fact that this hidden layer impacts everything that we do. So even when Dr. Melvin is speaking about healthcare and health access, and we're talking, and Dr. Grace is talking about educational opportunities, and we looked at Jamal in the video with generational impact of redlining and wealth building, we're looking also at generational impact of criminal history. Because when it impacts your grandparents, and then that increases the probability of the son or daughter, because women coming into the criminal justice system are coming at the highest rate, Black women, of any other group, in terms of the disproportionality, in terms of the factors. And so I say that because then you have the grandchild who, because of where they live or because of the limited opportunity that their parents have to offer them better opportunities, then they themselves are also at higher risk for criminal justice involvement. And so I just say that all to say, and I appreciated Dr. Melvin bringing up a quote from Dr. King. I had one also, that true peace is not merely the absence of tension, It is the presence of justice. And so when we talk about a criminal justice system that we know is wrought with so many inequities, with so much injustice, we can't let it go unnamed and part of this bigger picture of what all needs to be challenged to bring everyone, kind of what I heard what you say, Mr. Gordon, in my mind, that all hands on deck in terms of valuing human potential. Because when we don't value Jamal's parents and grandparents in this criminal justice system, then we don't recognize all the potential that Jamal has to help with curing cancer, to help with fighting poverty, to help with world peace. And so I just wanted to add that small part that the criminal justice system plays a huge role in limiting our human potential. And we at the SPLC are working to change that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, 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 very much, Ms. Jones. So, Ms. Calvert, you have, you're in a unique position here. We really wanted you to be a part of this. I especially did in working with the leadership of the, of just kind of putting this together. You are kind of, well, let me say this. I'm a big fan of Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's book, The Deepest Well. She talks a lot about how we can see the ills of our society in our children, in the youngest, most vulnerable of us. And many of the challenges start to manifest themselves in their early childhood education spaces. So you for Northeast Mississippi, for Monroe County, that's what you do. Would you talk a little bit about the importance of early childhood education, and how important it is for people across racial lines and across the power structure to work together for the benefit of our children at the early childhood stage?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. My name is Jennifer Calvert. I've been a director of Calvert's ABC Preschool and Nursery for 30 years. I have been lead partner for the Monroe Early Learning Collaborative for the last 4 years. And being part of that collaborative, I work with 3 school districts, 2 childcare sites, and Head Start. We all work together in the best interest of our children. And what I mean about that is we serve the 4-year-old children in Monroe County. And we come together to try to give them the best high quality services that we can offer them. All of our classrooms, we have lesson plans where we work on the same level. They're given the same opportunity. Every child across the board in Monroe County that's part of our program is given the same equal opportunity, whether they in Ambry School District, whether they in Hackley School District, whether they at Calvert's ABC, or then at MAP Head Start. We all work together for the best interests of our children, because we know the more that we can instill in our little children when they coming through at a young age, they retain, give them a good boost when they get ready to enter kindergarten. So we just work together in the best interest of our children.
Well, thank you. I think it's really important that we find and lift up bright spots of how we move forward. And I think working together to provide all of our young people equal high quality education is just so foundational. Dr. Grace, I want to come back to you because you have been, to use the biblical term, you've been laboring in the vineyard for a long time, trying to make sure that our citizens got a good start, got a really good early start. So, you know, you know what the structural challenges are. Talk a little bit about those structural challenges in education, and how, you know, where you think the people need to start to engage, or how you think they need to engage to talk and think clearly about systemic racism and the impact of it in the education space?
Well, if we're talking about it at a national level, then we have the group, I guess you could say, that sort of sets the table.
Mhm.
Because they will, through their appropriations, they will designate funds for certain elements of the early childhood spectrum. And this is whether they're in health, whether it's in education, mental health, what have you. That funding comes to the state along with the regulations that in many times allows the state to make some decisions about how that funding will come as far as service delivery to the young people and the families. And so this is where we get into state by state discussions and whether or not there is, again, the systemic racism that appears, so that the regulations are set to fit what the existing system is, rather than to look at changing the system so that there is a greater, broader population of children who can take advantage of the services. In early intervention in our state, we have just barely enough money to get a little bit of federal dollars. In our state, with the numbers of children who we know are born prematurely, the number of children who are not getting the full health care that perhaps that they should have because of access and other issues. We know that there are children who are in situations where there's not the cognitive stimulation. The brain development has taught us so much in terms of the research that's now been available to policymakers. Policymakers now in Washington reflect what is the best course for not only our health, but our economic development. We've got Nobel Prize winning economists who are telling us the best investment is early childhood. But there seems to be some lack of being able to communicate that from the federal level to the state level in Mississippi as much as it could be, even though our neighbors, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, have devoted millions and millions and millions of dollars to just the pre-K program that Ms. Calvert was talking about. So when we look at it from the state level, we can't say that the state leaders don't understand. I think it's whether or not there's priorities being assigned to certain things, and that gets in the way of where my heart lies. The other thing at the local level, Ms. Calvert talked about the success there in Monroe County. In Petal, Mississippi, which is down close to Hattiesburg. Years ago, that city council voted to give 1/2% of the tax base there in Petal to early childhood education. So whatever they bring in terms of the city taxes, then they get 1/2% devoted to the school district to develop early childhood programs. Now that has gone through 5 mayors and different leaderships, but that community has expected that to remain, and therefore it has. So those are some examples, as well as some issues I think that we need to look at from a community standpoint, and not just think everything's decided in Washington, because to be honest with you, there's much more decision making going on in Tupelo and Lee County and Monroe County that affects our children directly than in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to ask you a follow-up to that. One of the notes that I had, and this thing, maybe it's because we've come up on the 50th year of a lot of really kind of, I hope in some ways that they were turning points for our country, but I recognize we have a lot of work left to do. A few years ago, or not a few years ago, really last year, a lot of school districts in Mississippi, though I don't think they celebrated it, it was the anniversary of their 1970 integration. Many of the people, many of our policymakers, I think, our policymakers right now were in high school, coming out, going into high school. They were a part of those school integration groups. And they were all, some of them were in communities that resisted that a lot. Can you talk a little bit about, almost from a historical perspective, the long-term impacts of the kind of segregated education system we've had and the struggle we've had since then to have an to invest in an education system for all of our children?
Well, I started my public school teaching in Mississippi in the 1970s in a town in the Mississippi Delta. And so I have been a part of some of the, I guess you could say, mostly the experiences on the cusp of that, but still in the Delta, things were slow to actually comply with what federal law had stated years earlier. In terms of what we saw in the past and how that's influenced educational systems, when Head Start first started in Mississippi, that was one of the states that received a lot of money because of, at that time, Bobby Kennedy's visit to Tunica and Marian Wright Edelman and some other people that raised up the issue of poverty, extreme poverty in our state and what it was doing to the children. But then we had, at that time, we had a congressman in Washington that actually tried to prevent funds from coming to Mississippi for Head Start. Because again, they were seeing this, as somebody mentioned, as an opportunity for perhaps people not to be oppressed as much anymore because they could have better access to education. There was a lot of battles that went on at that time, but the funds for Head Start actually did come to our state. And right now there's over 20,000 children that are in a 4-year-old Head Start program. But we have a whole bunch of children who are able to qualify for Head Start, and they're not in our pre-K collaborative programs. And in many cases, they're in no license program. So we have to look at, again, what the investment the state is going to have to make if they really want to see changes in services to children. We don't have early childhood mental health specialists in our state. They do not exist. When we look at the issues around COVID now, and we're going to have more interventionists and so forth. So we look at not just one piece of the system that educates children. If we look at it comprehensive, particularly in young children, it's almost the entire, well, I call it a non-system as far as I guess you could say, the connections between different pieces of it and how it could be smoother, and we could actually save money if that took place. As far as education, public education, when I was in the Delta as a school teacher, and then I went back later on working at Mississippi Valley State as an assistant professor. The attitudes at that time, which may or may not have carried on forward, had to do with the development of private schools, primarily white individuals who were leaving the public schools to set up their own schools, which then took away any interest in public kindergarten. I was fortunate enough to work with Governor Winter on the Education Reform Act in 1982 and was the first early childhood coordinator. And I treasured the days that I had with him and with Dick Moppus and some of the others. But I would say that the fight we had in the Delta to just over public kindergarten, to have it funded and to have the embarrassment of CBS and other national news groups, we had to move that due to, I think, Governor Winter's statesmanship, number one, and number two, that it was the fact that we were almost the last state in the country to do this, and then how competitive would we be when states around us, once again, had already implemented the program. So the funding issues, to me, are reflective of our lack of respect for public education, for all children having the access that will help them to be the most successful person they can be. And so therefore we have this system again with the funding that may be tested if they go to court coming up here in the next several months about equity. But I think that we have not moved as fast, or we haven't had the interest to move as fast as our neighboring states to try to bring teacher salaries into a more alignment. We've had empty promises, empty promises, empty promises, and then there's always something else that comes ahead of the children and the teachers. And I would just say in closing on that, our teachers in this state have done a phenomenal job over the last 8 months. And I don't know that they have fully been appreciated. I will say the child care providers who are still open so the families can go to Dodge's store or can go to the bank or to go wherever, that they have to then what I call drive the economic engine in the community. If those child care providers weren't there, there wouldn't be the people at Dodge's and there wouldn't be the people at the bank. So whether or not we have the, first of all, the recognition of how critical this is for us to move away from institutionalized racism, because we have to first acknowledge that the systems that are going to help our youngest children, that's going to be tomorrow's future. That's tomorrow's leaders. And so if we don't invest early, as people would say often, then we're going to lose a lot on our return. And then I have my Dr. King quote. I just want to get in here. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And I think that's what part of this whole forum series is about, is so that we don't remain silent and that we speak our piece or our truth.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's so much there. So I'm an 80s baby, born in 1980. I was a Head Start kid. I'm right there with you in that. In early in your response, you talked about history. Of course, I took you back to 1970 to start with, but I'm curious from our other panelists, because I think it's important for the sessions that we will have over the next few months to talk a little bit about the history. It's not enough to say here we are right now, because I think there's a realization that a great many Mississippians were intentionally not taught the history that's produced these racist outcomes. Like, everybody knows that slavery existed, right? And there are people who say, actually, I'm sure that my colleagues, I hear it, my colleagues may hear it, listen, that stuff happened so long ago. And we just, can we just move on from it? So I'd like to ask Kia, you and Leslie in particular, to talk about the kind of continuum, like the long string of history that the things you described a short time ago in your introductions, they are not new. In many ways, I think Black people, for instance, are in as good a situation in many ways as we've been over the course of the history of this country and our time in Mississippi. So to be where we are in this tough spot is still way back on the path, right? So talk a little bit about the history that's gotten us to where we are. I'll let either one of you who wants to go first. Kia, you're leaning in, so Leslie, you okay if he jumps in there first?
Leslie, I can let you go first if you're so compelled. I don't want to press. Okay. Well, I think one way to think about the history, or rather, how do we get here today? Again, I'm a data guy, so I'll kind of start us off with some more data points, is that there are 473 counties in the United States and territories that are considered persistent poverty, okay? Persistent poverty is defined as any county that has experienced a poverty rate of at least 20% for the past 30 years, okay? In the Deep South, again, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, over a third, or approximately 1/3 of persistent poverty counties are located in those 5 states, okay? Mississippi has 48 persistent poverty counties, 27 of which are majority people of color counties. This is Mississippi, so it's quite safe to say that those counties are majority Black. They are majority Black. And the question is, when we think about how do we get here, we should be mindful that just because things may have happened in yesteryear, that doesn't mean that the effects dissipate as well. So we're talking about poverty that has existed persistently for at least 30 years. You know, Hope Policy was able to do the analysis, and we found that the persistent poverty counties in our region had not just been in poverty at least 20% for 30 years, but actually 50. So we're going back 50 years and looking at high poverty rates, and 50 years later, we're seeing the same rates of poverty. And so if anything, when we talk about what happened or how did we get here, I mean, I could talk to you about the impact of slavery. We could talk about redlining. We could talk about even in some historic senses of gentrification. But in reality, what we should be mindful of, and as much as we could talk about the history, we should be mindful of the contemporary ways in which the racial disparities are getting worse, right? So remember, here's a historical fact that in 1977, Congress passed the Community Reinvestment Act, which formally ended redlining and mandated that banks had to reinvest in low-income or economically distressed communities. But since March 2020, the Trump administration has actually rolled back several consumer protections that were a part of CRA, that were a part of affordable housing, and they were a part of just general consumer protections to keep Black and other low-income households from being preyed upon. And so I think too, just keeping that in mind is to say that we should be thinking about what are the ways that we are currently being preyed upon and what are the ways in which we can mitigate that predation. And I'll tell you that I also want to answer a question about structural, what are some structural challenges that we face in financing? I think one of the more obvious ways, easiest way to talk about it is what we call credit worthiness, in which you go to a financial institution to apply for a loan, and the first thing that mainstream financial institutions do is to look at your credit score. Okay, so if you don't have a good credit score, somewhere between 680 or better, you may be deemed either a riskier loan or you may be deemed credit unworthy or less credit worthiness. Okay, and that has the impact to produce, again, a second tier of financial services for a different population of Americans, right? Well, at the institutional level, we could mitigate that by changing the metric by which we determine a reliable or positive borrower. For CDFIs like Hope, we don't put too much emphasis on a borrower's credit score. We may use alternative forms of credit history to substantiate a borrower's ability to pay on time. So instead of looking at your credit score, we may look at your utility bills, right? Or we may look at your ability to, or other forms of assets, if you will. Okay, so that's one thing I also wanted to raise. And the second thing I wanted to raise, and I know Leslie will talk a bit more about this, is outstanding debt that comes with being poor, right? In the sense that what happens with incarcerated people, a colleague of mine at the Policy Institute, Calandra Davis, just recently published a paper looking at the intersection of criminal justice and financial services. And she found that the Deep South reports about $4 billion in outstanding criminal justice debt, criminal justice debt. Now you may be thinking to yourself, $4 billion is such a big number. How does that affect somebody's ability to be, one, economically stable, or two, to get involved in financial services? Well, that outstanding debt is outstanding. If you're not paid up on these debts, it could become a part of collections on your credit report. Now, if you have delinquent credit report entries, then that clearly affects your ability to get a loan or to get a mortgage product, okay? Now, that's just, and we're just talking about incarceration debt. We haven't even mentioned medical debt or student loan debt, right? We know that Black and brown borrowers are less likely to repay on these loans because many of these individuals and households are coming out of poverty. They're facing high unemployment rates, challenges to enter the labor force market, and just general, again, exclusion from mainstream financial services. Go back to my original point about 45% of Black households are either unbanked or underbanked, okay? And so what I'd say then is that just for us as a CDFI who's committed to increase in financial inclusion, we are constantly trying to find ways to systematize or institutionalize policies that will increase financial inclusion for those that are most underserved. And so much of my remarks have been about what happens in some way on the consumer side, right? You're a household, you're looking for a mortgage product, or you're looking for a small dollar loan. If you don't have access to a bank or a credit union, you'll get pushed to a payday lender, right? You'll get pushed to a car title lender, and you'll be exposed to high interest rates. 500% is what I mentioned for Mississippi. But what happens to small businesses, right? One of the benefits of having access to a financial institution is that you get access to affordable financial services, knowledge, and resources. What we've seen with the COVID-19 relief packages is that the federal government, in an unprecedented move, has levied trillions of dollars, okay, for the American people. Billions if we're talking about small businesses. Now, what's interesting is that minority-owned businesses are less likely to have a formal relationship with a financial institution. And it shows when we talk about the coronavirus relief efforts. We know that 90% of Black and brown-owned businesses are what we call sole proprietors. These are your beauticians, these are your barbers, these are your nail techs, right? And the first round of PPP funding, the Payment Protection Program money, was about over $300 billion, effectively bypassed sole proprietors because a policy, the legislation lacked a policy or guidance on what to do with sole proprietors, okay? So you see how the ways in which this financial policy or fiscal policy can either be a form of oppression or it could be a tool of justice, okay? So I'll stop here, so what we do as a CDFI is we try to mitigate the impact of those type of occurrences based on our relationships with small businesses of color and with small business, Black and brown households. Because once CDFIs were able to get access to the PPP program, once sole proprietors were able to get guidance on how to access the PPP program, CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, it could be a bank or a credit union, to get certification through the Department of Treasury that you're a mission-minded organization that will lend and increase resources in low-income communities. Once they got access to PPP, they leveraged $16 billion in PPP funds with the average loan just around $74,000, much of which, again, is being driven to communities of color. Okay, I'll stop there because I can keep going and going.
So let me say this: because of a few little technical issues at different points, a hard stop at 4. I feel like we'd be cheating the audience. So I want to go to 4 or 5, but I want to dedicate those 5 minutes to Leslie and Dr. Melvin. And I'll say this so that I don't have to talk as long, saying it in the end. The goal, this forum is the first. This is like the introduction to a gateway to deeper conversations in these specific areas. So for those people who are watching, those who are on Facebook, know that the deeper part of this is coming, and there are things that I'm sure everyone on hadn't gotten to go into as much detail on as they want, but that's going to be the purpose of those next sessions, because we know that this needs more. And frankly, I hope these 5 sessions are just the beginning of a much longer series and deeper engagement at the community level, especially in the Tupelo and Lee County area. So Leslie, let me open the floor to you to talk about that history piece, but anything else you want to kind of tease those people who could join the next session we're in.
Thank you. I will keep this brief and thank you again. What I can offer is just going back to a point that I raised earlier with regard to the history and the systemic and structural racism involved in the criminal justice system and how this looks over generations. Like the accumulation of wealth is a thing, and the accumulation of criminal history is a thing too, except it hurts us, it doesn't help us. And so one of the reforms that the SPLC focuses on is challenging the 3 strikes laws in Mississippi. As I mentioned before, a lot of us have heard of the war on crime from the 1970s. And one of the results of the war on crime were what became known as habitual offender or 3 strikes laws. And Mississippi in particular joined this trend in 1976 by creating 2 three-strike statutes. So these 3 strikes laws over the last 40 years have for over 40 years, actually almost 50 years, have played a substantial role in expanding the prison population here in Mississippi and also the cost of corrections. Mississippi spends more than $40 million a year to incarcerate individuals convicted of nonviolent habitual offenses without the same investment in rehabilitative services that historically have been proven to support people coming home. And so I just throw that in there because in connection with what Dr. Grace was saying, you know, when you don't pay for prevention, you pay a much bigger cost on the back end, on the other side. And so I'll just say this really quickly is that in 2013, there was a task force, a bipartisan task force, the Corrections and Criminal Justice Task Force created by the state of Mississippi to investigate the problem of over-incarceration and the correctional spending at the time. And so a result of that in the 2014 legislative session was House Bill 585. And so we'll get into this more later, but one point I just want to make in closing is that House Bill 585 effectively created a mechanism for about 1,000 Mississippians to become eligible for parole who would not otherwise have had any outlet for release back to their families, back to their communities, back to becoming productive citizens. And so when we translate that potential 1,000 Mississippians at approximately $54 per day, which is the cost now to house an adult in prison in Mississippi, we're talking about over $20 million in incarceration costs for just 1 year if we were to let 1,000 people go. And so I say that passing that on to Dr. Melvin, that what could she do with that $20 million? What could she do in reinvesting that into the future of our children, not just in education, but in healthcare and employment and access to better housing and better opportunities? And then the payoff of that $20 million in a more engaged community and a community that's ready to meet the needs, the many, many needs that we have here in the state of Mississippi. And so it all goes back to valuing human potential. And so with that, I'll just say thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the upcoming sessions where we learn more and we can engage together. Thanks.
Dr. Melvin, she did in fact ask my question. So what can you do with all that money? But certainly go ahead, add anything you'd like to that.
Well, I'll be quick on what I would like to add. The influence of race, racism, and implicit, explicit bias on health has been well documented. In 1991, the Institutes of Medicine released a seminal work called Unequal Treatment, where they did studies, they well documented the impact that our biases have on the treatment that we provide our patients. So that has been documented. I would just propose in closing that there is one thing that we can all do as citizens to address structural racism. And that's remember that we are not a true democracy in the sense that we like to think we are. We're actually a representative democracy. And those people that represent our best interests are the people that we send to Washington, to our state legislators. And so there's power in the vote, as can be seen and demonstrated in our last election. And so as we think about how to dismantle some of the current systems, we need to start thinking about who we're sending to make the laws and to sign into law these things that affect us. A good example in healthcare is Medicaid expansion. Data has been shown that states that have implemented Medicaid expansion have seen reductions in health disparities within those states, and states such as Mississippi who have not seen reductions in health disparities. And so when we think about the impact of these laws that we're continuing to perpetuate in Mississippi and throughout our southern states, we need to just begin to think about if the people that are actually enacting these laws are really acting in the best interest, not only for a few, but for even those minority, disadvantaged, and underserved communities that also need to participate in this democratic system that we have.
Wow, Thank you very much, Dr. Melvin. I will say it is important to the Winter Institute as an organization that we provide opportunities for our policymakers to develop equity lenses. It is not, it's just not to be assumed that they understand um, the full impact or how disparate the impacts will be sometimes on the decisions that they make. So thank you all so much for, I this could have easily been 2 hours. I'm so grateful for the contributions you've made thus far. I am excited for the people who have connected with this webinar through, of course, through Zoom, but also through Facebook Live. This is really, really critical work for us to do here in Mississippi. We don't have very much potential in this state that can be realized if we don't get this together, if we don't dismantle the systems and the structures that are creating the inequity we see now. One of the last thought I had before we move on is that we have to do this work together. And so I would like to challenge everyone who joined in today to connect with a friend, connect with a coworker, connect with a leader in your organization, and encourage them to participate. The sessions as we go forward are going to be much more participatory. We are hoping to seed community level conversations that go deeper. We are looking to invite people who are not just stakeholders, but decision makers in the institutions that frankly are either perpetuating systemic racism or dismantling it. And we want to make sure that we provide an opportunity for them to see clearly which one that they're doing. Budgets and P&Ls are moral documents. And it's the more we think about that, I think the better we'll be able to make decisions. Ms. Calvert, Dr. Grace, Ms. Jones, Mr. Burt, Dr. Melvin, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you in the Facebook audience, please leave any comments that you want. We will round those up, and more information will be forthcoming very soon on our sessions. They're going to be the third Sunday of each month, February, March, April, and May. The order of those, we will publish those. I know education is first, and we're gonna keep them rolling monthly after that. Thank you all so much again for joining us. Have a great Sunday evening. Enjoy King Day tomorrow. Be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.